Hello, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. Happy to be here today, here with Nathan. How are you today, babe?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's been a minute since we have recorded together because I have been busy working closely with Carolyn Pearson this last week or so, but it's always fun to have Nathan back. And actually, this is a subject today that we are uniquely qualified to talk about because it's all about how to learn from your mistakes in parenting.
We are experts at that.
We are experts. And maybe many of you feel that way too. If you're lucky enough to have it, well, this can kind of apply to parenting, but it can apply to any number of other endeavors where sometimes the very best kind of learning comes from doing it wrong and reflecting and pausing and getting some valuable feedback from either your own internal experience or from the people around you. And having the ability, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, to reflect and recognize that there are things that we could have done differently. So today we're going to talk about parenting, and I'm going to be reading from, just briefly, a couple little sections from a book that I will go ahead and link this in the show notes. It's a book called Living an Examined Life, Wisdom for the Second Half of the Journey, and the author is one of my favorites. So this name may not be familiar to you. Maybe you haven't read from him, but if you haven't read from him, I recommend you do so. And you certainly have heard me say his name before because I do tend to like to talk about him a lot. His name is James Hollis, and he is a Jungian analyst. And in my opinion, perhaps he's certainly an easier analyst to read than Jung himself. I've read some of Jung's primary works, and they're very, very challenging for me. But I can read James Hollis all day, and I really enjoy him. Anything you want to add to this, Nathan? Because I know you have read some of Jung or Hollis's stuff.
I have not read any of Jung's stuff. I have read lots of Hollis's stuff, and yeah, no, I just wholeheartedly endorse your endorsement.
Okay, so today, as I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to be talking about parenting. This book is actually a book that really hones in on examining your own life, and it talks about all sorts of various things. I'm not going to name everything it talks about, clearly, but it talks a lot about enlightenment, learning how to get unstuck, what our gifts are and how we're withholding them, how we have self-destructive patterns that we, the more awakened and enlightened we become, the less we the more we're able to heal from these self-destructive patterns. It also talks about choosing meaning over happiness and how to seize our own personal authority. Okay, so as part of this, it talks about how to really become wide awake to the suffering that we cause ourselves and others in our closest relationships. And so this is what I want to start with. The chapter is called Free Your Children from You. And I have to be honest with you, when I can remember the very moment that I first learned about this concept. I was riding on my bike. I do a lot of bike riding. We live around a lot of lakes here in the Midwest, and I love listening to an audiobook or a podcast and riding my road bike around the lake. And one day I was listening to this book on Audible, and I was so stunned by this particular section that I pretty much had to stop in my tracks, rewind it, and listen to it several more times over and over and over again, because it was such, at this point in time for me, it was transformative in my own views, and it shifted my paradigms. Or I guess I should say, my paradigms had already been shifting, and these words gave language to what I was already beginning to experience as a parent. So he begins like this. He says this: perhaps the key measure of successful parenting, despite whatever mistakes we have made, is whether our children really understand that we love them as they are, not as we wish them to be. This rather simple test is much harder to meet than it first appears. To be able to pull back our expectations of them, that they make us proud of ourselves, that they ratify our religious, political, and cultural values, first requires that we are really addressing the task of our own individuation and not imposing our unfinished business on our children. Jung's observation that the greatest burden the child must carry is the unlived lives of the parents is chilling, frankly, for it puts all of the responsibility for growing up back on us. In order to be a good parent, apparently, I have to be a more evolved person in the first place. I've read this so many times, and it never fails to just fill me with happiness, and actually kind of gives me chills too. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts as we take a moment and pause there, Nathan Hamaker?
Well, I think it's a pretty straightforward observation. It's just that until it gets pointed out to you, you don't realize how badly you're doing it. I think of, for example, the kids that all play sports. So many of the kids who are involved in sports are really playing the sports because their parents want to relive some of their own ego needs. So I need my child to be a star football player or baseball player or the captain of the cheerleading team, not because it's good for them, but because it's good for me. I want to feel like I was a good parent. I want to feel like my child stands out above your child, and I want my children to follow in my footsteps because that validates the life that I either lived or wish I had lived. And it leads to all the conflict that you hear about in children's sports when you hear about these parents breaking out in fights in the stands and just ridiculous things like that. It's because of exactly what Jungian is saying, or in Hollis here, but the unlived lives of the parents trying to live them back out through their children creates a humongous pile of dung for the ego of the parent, and the parents start behaving really erratically. And the other thing that I noticed is he said, we have to love our children for who they are, which again feels like such a radical concept, and yet that's exactly how we envision God, is loving us as exactly who we are. So, why would we hold ourselves to a different standard than the standard we want God to hold us to? God loves us how we are, so we need to love our children as they are. And God doesn't need us to gratify his ego. We don't need our children to gratify ours.
That's really beautiful, that God loves us just as we are, and they do not need us to look a certain way for them to be okay.
Yep.
And I think that is something that we have to keep circling around over and over and over again, because for whatever reason, we do tend to want our children to be a reflection of us and our beliefs and our preferences, and even the way they present themselves in the world oftentimes is in sometimes a subtle way and sometimes a not so subtle way. It's a way that we are trying to work out our own shadow stuff, the stuff that we have not yet resolved around ourselves. And I know for me, you talk about sports a lot. I talk about music because I was not a musical kid. Well, let me put it this way. I sure wanted to be a musical kid.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, I was in the junior high and high school systems where I grew up. Music was a big deal. I know every school sort of has its own status things. And to be in music was a very big deal, and all the cool kids were in these things. And I am not naturally very musical. I'm mediocre. I wouldn't say I'm horrible, but I'm just solidly mediocre, and I was not competitive. And there's a lot of pain associated with what I felt like was some rejection and some isolation because I didn't get picked. I wasn't chosen in those ways as a child. And so because we have 4 children, some of them have naturally been musicians and some have not. And I think the most painful ones for me are the ones who have natural musical aptitude, but no interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I find myself really I'm projecting onto them my own childhood struggles,
Right.
wanting them to have all of this beautiful experience and success, but it's not about them. It's more about me.
Yeah.
And even as I have had the awareness that I don't want to do that to my kid, I sometimes find myself actually wanting to do that to my kid because we're selfish creatures, right? We want what we want. And until we become really accountable that, you know what, Valerie, this is about you. This is not about the kid. Stop it. Like stand down, woman. So
sometimes we project on our kids things that we wish we had.
Yeah.
Like with you in music. Other times we project on our kids things that we did give them. Like, for instance, if we teach our children the gospel and then they reject it or follow a different path, And then we think, well, gosh, was what I taught you not good enough for you? Or did I fail as a parent? Or did I not teach this well? But again, we like to hold things either because we wish we had had them, like your example of the music and my example of the sports, or because we did have it, and if the child doesn't follow that, we see it as a rejection, and neither of them are true.
Well, and I think the other thing to kind of pick up on, or that I'm picking up on while I was listening to you, Nathan, is that I think what we do sometimes in the church is we instill a lot of cognitive and psychological rigidity in our children if that's how we are. And so sometimes what happens is as they are doing the thing that a human being is supposed to do, which is become themselves, we take that as a personal assault on us.
Right.
When actually developmentally, that's exactly what a human being is here to do, is to take in data and learn and listen to the big people around them and eventually become themselves and integrate what feels right for them, because they are not us. They are different than us. And yet sometimes I think we think, no, you're basically an extension of me, and I want you to look, act, believe, and feel like me. And if you don't do that, it hurts me. But really what happens by that kind of cognitive and psychological rigidity, we are estranging ourselves from intimacy with them because we're not actually letting them do the developmental work of growing up.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I've heard parents say, I'm so embarrassed when my child, XYZ. And I think to myself, why?
Right.
He's like, oh, that's only true if you consider your child an extension of you.
Well, we've been actually conditioned to believe that our children are extensions of us, right? I mean, I think, even though I think that it was meant well, is that what, am I trying to say that right? They meant well by these statements, no other success can compensate for failure in the home, or those kinds of things, which is your children are an extension of you. And so therefore that's really the most important way to define your identity and your needs and your ego needs, I guess I should say. And it inadvertently actually puts a really big burden on the children to show up and be and believe a certain way to make their parents proud of them. And I think sometimes a child will grow into an individual that actually does quite nicely align with the values of their parents naturally by their temperaments. And if that's the case, then I guess for them, that's not where they're going to have the growth edge. But for a lot of us, our children are not going to do that. And rather than grieving or causing conflict or having internal conflict or having conflict with them, the very best thing we can do is celebrate that they are uniquely themselves and it is their job to become themselves. Something that is very interesting that I'm noticing in a lot of our dialogue in the groups that you and I do together, Nathan, is that this is even something that older people are grappling with their elderly parents. 50 and 60-year-old individuals are really struggling in individuating or becoming uniquely themselves with their 70 and 80-year-old mothers and fathers in their own faith journey. So
that's too bad, because people need to be able to be honest with their parents, and they say, well, my parents can't handle it. Well, that's on your parents. And while we don't like the idea of hurting another person, maybe it's time for you to push your parents to grow up a little bit.
Well, yes and no. Can we stay there and just play with that idea for a second?
Sure.
And the reason why I'm saying yes and no is because I always, when I'm working with somebody and we're talking about them pressuring a relationship, I'm always interested in knowing what the individual maps as the competency level of the other person.
Sure.
Right. And so, for example, I'm thinking of one particular individual who has an 80-year-old elderly mother. And it's one of those lovely, lovely elderly women who the entire house is filled with every church book and the work and the glory and all of the very ultra orthodox kinds of things. And this is the mother's home. It's her happy place. Not only her literal home, it's her psychological home. And this woman in my group says, I don't know what good would be accomplished by my letting her into my dark night of the soul, because while I feel comfortable where I am, my mother does not have the psychological maturity, or quite frankly, the physical health, or
Mhm.
maybe even the spiritual maturity to handle this. And of course, what we kind of talked about was, well, the price we pay, the price that is paid when one party just cannot handle us, our growth, is a lack of intimacy. But I think sometimes people make a judicious choice that the other, in this case, the elderly woman, it wouldn't be productive for the 60-year-old faith journeying woman to drop that on her mother, because she feels like it would actually hurt her and not ultimately help her in their particular situation.
So what you're saying is that if there's not necessarily an impetus for having that discussion, you wouldn't necessarily bring it out. But so let me ask you this though, in a situation where perhaps the parent is organizing a family temple trip,
Right.
and I don't have a temple recommend,
Mm,
which I mean I do, but I'm just saying that a person doesn't,
yeah.
and they don't feel comfortable going to the temple, and they don't want to go in and have an interview with their bishop and answer questions in a way that isn't honest with their own integrity.
Yeah.
Would you then, how would you then counsel that person?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the standing relationship between that individual and their parents. I think it can be anywhere from, I appreciate the invitation, but right now I'm not going to be able to go on this temple trip, and it's not something that I'm really I'm not willing to talk about this right now with you.
So give them as much
Mhm.
information as is necessary
Yes.
to live within your integrity, but no more.
Right. And in another relationship, another kind of relationship, it could be more like, I'm not going to be able to go to the temple with the family, and I would be more than happy to share with you more about my journey if you're interested. And if you feel like you would like to know more about me, and if it's something that you feel like will help you understand me and help our relationship.
So give them as much information as they need and an open door for further discussion.
And I think it has to do not only with what we feel like they're capable and competent in holding, or what we suspect, right? I think it's always kind of a little bit unknown, but also I think it's got to be what we feel like we are comfortable in talking about based on our own, where we are in our own journey. I think sometimes there's different like phases in faith journey, but I also think there are like micro phases inside of each phase,
Mm,
right? And so I think sometimes someone may feel really tender and fragile, and and maybe they have a strong, or perhaps, how do I say this, a parent who will bring on either some scare tactics or grief tactics or manipulation tactics. And I say tactics clearly too many times, because I'm not saying that these parents are necessarily
premeditating.
right. They're not trying to do any of these things, but because of the fear embedded in our theology around someone not being able to go to the temple of all things, I mean, that for some parents is going to feel like, you know,
Betrayal.
massive, not just, yes, betrayal, but eternal betrayal,
Loss of salvation. Yeah.
loss of salvation. And so, because if I'm feeling fragile and I know what it's going to do to my mother or my father, maybe I don't have the personal strength today to talk about that with her. I'm still trying to strengthen my little Bambi legs and get myself a little stronger in how I am experiencing my own, expanding faith experience. And I don't necessarily have the bandwidth to manage her or his grief,
Mm.
or fear or shame or confusion or whatever. And so it's very, very, very nuanced. And I think it's something that each individual in our coaching sessions, in the groups, I hear this, is a consistent theme. How do I be true to myself and navigate these tough situations? And in many cases, it's not, maybe in every case I could say, it's context dependent, it's relationship dependent.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing, I think, is that you would tell people to be true to themselves, to honor their integrity.
Yeah.
But as far as working through that relationally, be aware of where both you and the other person
Yes.
are sitting as to how quickly and how much to move through that way.
Yes.
But not that they would compromise their integrity on something they didn't believe in.
Sure. And
Okay.
actually, yes. And so what we're describing in this sort of tenuous situation between an adult and their adult parents, if they're afraid to talk about their own internal experience, whether it be specific to your question about the temple or anything else, the fear that they have is nested in a larger problem in that system, which is that the parent in that dynamic is struggling with letting their child become themselves.
Right.
Okay, and so that leads me to the next part. I'm just going to read this, you guys. It's a page and a half long, so hang in there with me. I'll do my best to sound animated so it doesn't just sound like a boring person reading something. Okay, so this is Hollis again. He says, I truly believe that the history of the world would change if we could just imagine parents healthy enough, wise enough, mature enough, evolved enough to say to their growing children something like the following: who you are is terrific. You are here to become yourself as fully as you can. Always weigh the costs and consequences of your choices as they affect others, but you are here to live your journey, not someone else's, and certainly not mine. I am living my journey, so you don't have to worry about me. You have within you a powerful source. Call it your instinct, your intuition, your gut wisdom, which will always tell you what is right for you. Serve that, respect that. Be generous to yourself and others, but always live what is right for you. Life is really rather simple. If you do what is right for you, it is right for you and others. If you do what is wrong for you, it will be wrong for you and others. Know that we may not always agree on things, and that is fine, because we are different people, not clones. Always know that I will respect you and value you no matter what your choices, and you will always find here people who love you and care about you. He goes on to say, I believe this message, however worded, would change the world because we would not have so many damaged people making their own babies in order to pass on their pathology. We would not have so many people turned violent because of the rage in their own troubled souls. We would not have so many self-defeating, avoidant, drug-addled, and unlived lives of people if people were not so estranged from their own souls. We would not have so many mindless folks who drift to politics and preachers to offer them simplistic solutions to life's problems, giving them people to blame rather than holding themselves accountable, and who give them ideologies to embrace rather than the legitimate risk and reward that living their own journey provides. If we are ever going to free our children, if we wish to be freed from the web our parents may have spun from us, we have to generate our own lives. If we really do love our children as we profess, then we have to free them from our expectations that they live like us. Why should they? Is not our doing that sufficient? Why would they have to replicate our lives unless it was not about what it seems to be about, which is, okay, let me start that over again. Why would they have to replicate our lives unless it was not about what it seems to be about, parental concern, but rather about our insecurity and what we have lacked the courage to face our own lives. Where I am stuck, my children will be stuck or will be diverting a significant amount of energy to compensate to get unstuck. Where I am bound by fear, by lack of permission, they too will be bound. Where I'm looking to others to help me evade growing up, either they will replicate my insecurity, my immaturity, or become unduly burdened by responsibilities. As parents, mentors, leaders of one kind or another, we are called to grow up, take care of business, gain our own authentic journeys, and thus lift this terrible distraction of the soul off of those whom fate has brought into our care. This is how we are healed. This is how our children are healed, and their possibilities can be liberated. Okay, I feel like I just have read a whole bunch. So why don't you tell me a couple of the things that come up for you that you thought about while I was reading that, as far as your own experience, learning, growing in our parenting journey. Well, I guess in your parenting journey, but since we've kind of done it together, both of our parenting journeys.
Yeah. So two words or phrases that came up a couple times in that last reading was growing up and being stuck or getting unstuck. So for me, the idea of being stuck means that in my parenting and in my own thought processes, I would repeat the same patterns over and over again, expecting or hoping things to change, and they really don't. Almost like the definition we use of insanity. But we go through these cycles of parenting, hoping our children will act a certain way, then they don't. We get upset. Because we're upset, they sort of conform to what we want them to look like briefly, and then it's not really who they truly are. And so they kind of go back to their other patterns, and then it offends us or angers us, and then we get on them again, and we get in this cycle. And I guess I should say I get in that cycle, and for me, that's what it meant to be stuck. And when Hollis says we need to grow up, to me, it means, and he actually said this early in the paragraph that you read, to leave the kids to be free because I am free. So if I am free of attachments to the way that my children supposedly reflect on me, then I am free to leave them to grow into who they want to be. And I guess the one thing I would qualify on that is that there are probably times when kids don't want to do things that they really do need to do. So for instance, if my child decides that school is not for me and I'm not going anymore, but he's 11, I'm probably going to still intervene there and say, you're not old enough, you're not mature enough to really make that kind of decision. So we're not talking about things that could be potentially harmful or damaging to the child. If my 12-year-old says, hey, I think it's time for me to try alcohol, I'm probably going to say no. But in terms of just who they are, what they want to believe, how they want to see the world, when they're 10, let them think they want to be police officers. And when they're 16, let them think they want to join the military. Just give them the freedom to explore, to think, to learn, and to develop their own values within a framework that is still obviously safe.
I love that. And I think the thing that I'm also thinking about is that I think there are a couple of conversations that could be had here, and it's a different conversation with a younger child than it is with an older child and an emerging adult. But I would go so far as to say that I also think sometimes even parents will project onto their younger children stresses and strains that are not necessarily healthy.
Sure.
Right? Meaning, I know that, like, for example, if there are certain families that place a lot of value on athletics or some form of the fine arts or a very high standard of scholarship, and that is the family value, it can put an enormous amount of stress and strain and poor ego structure. It can create in a child a sense of their own unworthiness and failure if they don't conform to the ego needs of their parents. And that's why this is a nuanced conversation, because in saying that, I'm not saying that it's not there's a healthy way to help a child recognize the importance of cultivating responsibility, finishing school assignments, knowing how to study for a test. Those are good, solid human development skills. But I think we all can become more and more savvy about recognizing when we're pushing them too far, and that we're pushing them too far on any of those things because of our own unfinished business.
Mm-hmm.
Let's transition over as we close, Nathan, to how does this apply to spirituality? Because I do think to really hone in on where we do our work and where we've really worked hard as a couple is in helping our own children recognize that we have values, and there are things that we hold dear and that we're working on that are even becoming more complicated in our lives. And also at the same time, our older teenage children and our young adult children have the liberty to become beautifully themselves, and they do not need to feel like they have to conform to any of the teachings, the gospel teachings that you and I have instilled in them or have even observed ourselves. That we are giving them the ability to really craft their own relationship with themselves, others, God, and the world. and we're standing by supporting them and receiving them as they are.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think it just kind of boils down to the same thing. You pointed out a really good question, which is if I'm directing my child, am I directing them because I think that there's a safety issue, or am I directing them because I am trying to defend my own ego? And I think that's a really good standard to hold up. I can see sometimes my children doing things that might violate a teaching of the church, and I look at it and I say, well, but that's a dangerous choice. And so I do still feel like, I would say something, even if it's a child who doesn't believe in the church anymore.
Is it
So
more about the church, or is it more about it's dangerous in terms of their relationship to their body, to the world, to
right,
God?
but that's my point. So for instance, let me just use an example of that has come up a lot in the groups of a child who's not living what we call the law of chastity in the LDS church. Okay, if it's from a standpoint of, hey, I taught you to be moral and you're not following these examples, and now I'm worried you can't go to the temple, that might not be a healthy discussion.
Sure.
If it's from the standpoint of, hey, are you being safe? Have you gone through the proper steps of developing a relationship? Do you know this person well enough to give your body to them? That's a question that is centered around safety and proper psychological development. And so I think that there are conversations that can be had about difficult subjects, but you, as you pointed out, you need to know within yourself, are we talking about this from a health and safety standpoint, or are we talking about it from an ego standpoint? Because that's not the same conversation.
Well, and one is nested in love and the other is nested in
Fear.
fear. And so once again, for us to just check in with ourselves about how we are feeling when we are doing this kind of parenting. And also something else, and you may not agree with this, Nathan, but I have noticed myself that I very seldom impose my ideas and opinions on my older children, especially the young adults, unless asked for.
Yeah,
And
no, that's totally true.
and
But more on the younger kids.
right. And I've noticed, though, the interesting paradox with that is the less I impose myself on them, the more they actually come to me
hmm
and are interested in what I think and feel about things, partly because I think they know that I am staying in my own lane. I'm letting them live their own lives.
hmm
And I think also they know that I'm not going to be placing judgment or condemnation on them.
Right.
And I also recognize that that it's important for them to learn the lessons that they need to learn in their one big beautiful life, and that in certain cases they're going to be learning those lessons in ways that I may not prefer myself,
Experientially.
but that's okay.
hmm
And the price we pay for our own judgment and closeness with our people, our children, is a loss of intimacy.
hmm
If we don't want to be troubled by their complexity, there's a very easy way to not be troubled by that. Just become very, very rigid and stern and dogmatic.
And cut them off.
And well, they cut us off.
Yeah, that's true. Cut each other off.
Right. Is that if we do that, then they'll get the message and they'll say, never mind. I don't think that you're honoring my journey. And so I'm not interested in talking to you about something where there really may be an actual safety concern that they want to come to us for something that we won't even know about it, because they'll have closed us out because they don't feel like we truly unconditionally love and accept them.
Yeah. And I would just add on top of that, because it's really good stuff. I had to learn to ask more questions.
Sure.
If somebody said, hey, I really don't, want to finish my math assignment tonight, I used to just get in their face. But now I'll ask questions like, why? Why don't you want to finish your math assignment tonight? What's going on? Well, the truth is that I've been lost in math for a week and I'm just, I have no idea how to do it. Oh, okay. Well, fine. We can help with that. Okay. Well, the truth is I stayed up really late last night and I'm just really tired and I want to go to bed. Well, we need to talk about that. And so I had to learn asking lots and lots and lots of questions to get to what the root of the real issue was. And then, like you said, separate something that is healthy from something that is ego driven in the resolution process.
Yes. Yeah. And one last thing that I'll say, and I'm really referencing here adult children, is that, and I see this as a clinician comes up in our small groups and things like that, is that even sometimes a grown child is going to prefer the less healthy option. And once again, because we're allowing them their own life, we have to be okay even sometimes with that.
Yep.
Like, we cannot become the judge and the jury and condemn them and think that in any universe that is going to work, because it's not.
No. And it's not how God works.
It's not how God, beautiful, right? That's exactly right, Nathan. It's not how God works anyways. God does not intervene and take our agency away to sometimes protect us from certain situations and consequences that are formative to the development of our souls, which is far more important than jumping in front of something
and getting it right.
And getting it right.
Yeah.
So, but it's all about this beautiful concept of letting us and letting our children live our own beautiful lives, and recognizing that we are here to become ourselves. And if we can honor that as parents, the gift that we will, or the blessing will come in the intimacy that we get with these children. So, okay, that's all for today, everybody. So good to have this conversation with any of you. If you would like to jump into one of these small groups, I believe they're all full right now, but go ahead and reach out to me so that you can get on a wait list. You can find me at info@valeriehamaker.com, or you can find me on Instagram at Latter-day Struggles Podcast. We are getting ready to launch an updated website, but that is not quite ready yet. So that to be more information to come. Please keep those ratings and reviews coming in. I know what we talk about is touchy and sensitive, and so it's so important that we have these positive ratings and reviews to help newcomers really feel safe in our care, and that comes from you. And last but not least, if you would please share this with friends and families and loved ones. It helps the podcast spread. And I did say last but not least, and I didn't actually mean that. I do have one last thing. If you're interested in individual work, I do time-limited consults personally. Reach out to me for that at info@valeriehamaker.com. Or if you're interested in more long-term coaching, I have some people that work for me that can offer you that. Okay, good to be with you, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.